The body stayed down there for 8 days, 170 feet of cold water, then another 100 to the lake bottom, where the crumpled blue Yugo rested with Leslie Ann Pluhar still inside. Above, on the roadway, traffic never stopped. 4 million crossings a year. Nobody slows down. The bridge charges $4 per car collected in both directions, generating revenue sufficient to maintain 552 vertical feet of tower, 42,000 miles of cable, 8,614 feet of suspended steel. Paint costs $2 million per year. Labor, another $3 million. The math works because the cars keep coming. But the math worked before Leslie died too. And it worked when 5 men fell during construction, their families compensated according to the formulas available in 1954 through 1956. Was the bridge worth building? Or does the bridge make itself worth it by continuing to stand? The ferries lost money every year, and everyone knew it. By 1950, the Michigan State Highway Department operated 9 vessels across the Straits of Mackinac, shuttling automobiles between the upper and lower peninsulas on a route that had been in service since 1923. The largest ferry, the city of Petoskey, could carry 150 cars. On a good day, with all 9 boats running and the weather cooperating, the fleet could transport 9,000 vehicles. On hunting weekends in November, cars lined up for 16 miles south from Mackinac City. Families sleeping in their vehicles, waiting sometimes 24 hours for passage across 4 miles of water. The ferries employed approximately 400 workers during their final years of operation. Captains, deckhands, ticket agents, maintenance crews. The payroll alone exceeded the revenue collected from fares. The state subsidized the operation with highway funds, money that might have paved roads or built overpasses elsewhere. By 1952, the annual loss approached $417,000, the precise sum the legislature would later agree to contribute toward operating a bridge. Chase Osborne, former governor, wrote in the 1930s that Michigan was unifying itself, that a magnificent route was developing through the state to Lake Superior and the Northwest. He did not mention that winter ice made the route impassable for weeks at a time, or that the ferry service established to solve this problem had simply replaced one form of seasonal isolation with another, summer congestion so severe that commerce ground to a halt under the weight of its own success. People wanted the connection. The state provided the connection. The connection became unsustainable. This pattern would repeat. By June 1950, when engineers were finally retained to study the bridge project seriously, cars queuing for the ferry at Mackinac City did not reach St. Ignatius until 5 hours later. The typical ferry capacity of 460 vehicles per hour could not match the estimated 1,600 vehicles per hour that a bridge might handle. The numbers made the case. A bridge was not romantic. But arithmetic is never just arithmetic when the structure costs $100 million and the communities it connects have a combined population under 4,000 people. 20 years of trying taught Prentice Brown what rejection looked like in every possible form. Brown grew up in St. Paul's, Ignatius at the turn of the century, gazing south across the straits at a shoreline he could see but couldn't easily reach. As a young prosecuting attorney in Mackinac County, he once missed an argument before the Michigan Supreme Court because winter ice across the straits made travel to Lansing impossible. He later recalled that bitter hike across the frozen water as formative, the moment he understood that geography could be a prison without visible bars. By 1950, Brown had served in the United States Congress and Senate, directed the Office of Price Administration under Franklin Roosevelt, and chaired the board of Detroit Edison Company. He knew how power moved through institutions. He knew how money moved through them, too. When the new Mackinac Bridge Authority appointed him chairman in 1950, he accepted the position without pay. This was not charity. This was the calculation of a man who understood that unpaid labor signals either desperation or certainty, and sometimes both. The authority's first attempt to secure financing came in 1951, when engineers reported that a bridge could be built and financed with revenue bonds for $86 million. The state legislature authorized the sale of $80 to $5 million in bonds in April 1952. Then they waited for buyers. None came. The bond market weakened through 1953. Investment houses in New York looked at the proposal and saw a 4-mile gap of water, 2 towns with a combined population under 4,000, and a state government willing to invest exactly $1 symbolic in construction costs. The numbers didn't justify the risk. The bridge backers tried again in March, failed. Tried again in June, failed. By autumn 1953, the Michigan legislature had given the authority until December 31st to secure financing or the deal would expire. The state's offer to contribute $417,000 annually for operations and maintenance, less than the ferry service was already losing, would vanish. The project would die, again, as it had died in the 1930s when federal funding never materialized despite endorsements from the Army Corps of Engineers and President Roosevelt. Then a man named Jim Abrams attended a World Series game at Yankee Stadium. Abrams worked as vice president at Allen & Company, an investment firm that, in the words of one historian, was not considered big league. At the game, a friend mentioned that the Mackinac Bridge Authority was desperate. By November 11th, Abrams was sitting at a table in the Drake Hotel in New York with Bridge Authority representatives, $500,000 in earnest money ready, proposing a complicated 2-tiered financing structure that would pay some investors more than others, but give them higher risk. It was novel. It was unlikely. On December 17th, with holidays approaching and time running out, the Mackinac Bridge Authority accepted a bid for bonds worth $90.99. 150 investment brokers underwrote the sale for a commission of $3 million. The deal closed with 13 days to spare. David Barnard Steinman grew up in the shadow of the Brooklyn Bridge and spent his entire life trying to escape it. Born in 1886 in Lower Manhattan, Steinman rarely spoke of his parents or his 6 siblings in later years. What mattered was the bridge overhead, the engineering marvel that dominated the skyline of his childhood. He worked his way through City College, graduating summa cum laude in 1906, then earned 3 degrees from Columbia University, culminating in a doctorate in civil engineering. His dissertation proposed a steel truss arch design for the Henry Hudson Bridge. 20 years later, he would build it. By the 1930s, Steinman had designed hundreds of bridges across multiple continents. He co-founded the National Society of Professional Engineers in 1934 and served as its first president, campaigning for stricter educational and ethical standards in the profession. But his reputation remained secondary to that of Othmar Ammann, his former colleague under Gustav Lindenthal and his rival for 4 decades. Ammann's George Washington Bridge opened in 1931. Joseph Strauss's Golden Gate followed in 1937. Steinman's structures were technically sophisticated, but rarely captured public imagination. Then came Tacoma. On November 7, 1940, the Tacoma Narrows Bridge in Washington state collapsed in 40-mile-per-hour winds. The suspension bridge had been open for 4 months. Witnesses described the deck twisting violently, undulating like a ribbon, before sections broke free and plunged into Puget Sound below. Film footage of the collapse would be shown in engineering classrooms for generations. Steinman had predicted it. At a 1938 meeting of the Structural Division of the American Society of Civil Engineers, with the Tacoma Bridge's designer in the audience, Steinman warned that the slender design lacked sufficient torsional rigidity. The bridge used 8-foot-deep plate girders instead of the 25-foot-deep trusses originally proposed. It was elegant. It was economical. It was aerodynamically unstable. The collapse vindicated Steinman's theories but also cast doubt on all long-span suspension bridges. If the most modern design could fail in relatively light wind, what did that mean for future projects? Steinman responded by publishing a series of articles on aerodynamic stability, proposing specific design features: deep stiffening trusses, open grid roadways to reduce wind resistance, mechanical dampers to dissipate vibrational energy. When the Mackinac Bridge Authority appointed him design engineer in January 1953, Steinman saw his opportunity. The bridge would incorporate every lesson from Tacoma. The deck would feature a 38-foot deep truss and an open steel grid in the center lanes to allow wind to pass through. The theoretical critical wind velocity would reach 642 miles per hour, essentially infinite for practical purposes. But theory is tested in water 200 feet deep, in sub-zero winter temperatures, in ice pressure that can crush concrete piers. Steinman designed the tower's concrete piers with a safety factor of 20 times the maximum ice pressure ever achieved under laboratory conditions. Each pier would be sheathed in armor plate above and below areas of potential ice contact. The foundation would descend to bedrock more than 200 feet below the water's surface, requiring innovations in underwater concrete placement that would set world records. Steinman understood that the bridge would be scrutinized more intensely than any suspension bridge since Tacoma. Every calculation would be questioned. Every design choice would be compared to the failure that haunted the profession. He also understood that if the Mackinac Bridge succeeded, it would be his crowning achievement. And if it failed, his name would be linked to two disasters instead of one. Ground was broken on May 7, 1954, and immediately the lake began teaching lessons about resistance. The Straits of Mackinac connect Lake Michigan and Lake Huron, two bodies of water large enough to generate their own weather systems. Currents run up to 5 miles per hour. Ice forms in winter, breaks apart, reforms, creating pressure that can bend steel. The water depth varies from shallow near the shores to over 200 feet in the navigation channel. Wind funnels through the gap between peninsulas with little to slow it down. Before any cable could be strung or deck assembled, the bridge needed foundations. 4 massive anchor blocks, 2 at each end, would secure the main cables to bedrock. 2 tower piers would rise from the lake bottom to support towers that would eventually stand 552 feet above the water. Each element required solving problems that had never been solved at this scale in these conditions. Merritt Chapman and Scott Corporation won the $25 million contract to build all foundations. They assembled what was described as the largest bridge construction fleet ever mobilized: derrick barges, pile drivers, cement mixers, floating dormitories. Over 500 workers were housed in St. Ignace during peak construction periods. The anchor blocks came first. Each would weigh 170,000 tons and descend 100 feet below the water's surface, while rising 119 feet above it. The north anchor block required excavation in bedrock beneath 30 feet of water. The south anchor block sat in slightly shallower water but required removing layers of glacial till before reaching stable foundation. For the tower piers, engineers on site designed and built a custom pile driver they nicknamed the Gizmo. The device had to drive concrete piers into bedrock at depths exceeding 200 feet, working through shifting currents and around ice flows. When conventional concrete proved impractical for underwater work at such depths, they used prepocked concrete, a newer material better suited for underwater consolidation. In May 1955, they poured 200,000 tons of concrete into the bridge foundations, setting a world record for underwater concrete placement. The work stopped every winter. Construction proceeded only during the 4 summer seasons between 1954 and 1957. No safety harnesses, no nets beneath the workers. The crews worked on platforms suspended over water cold enough to kill a man in minutes. Frank Pepper died first in September 1954. Diving accident. The Bends. His body was recovered. Lesarge fell into a caisson while welding in October 1954. Head injuries. Body recovered. Albert Abbott fell from a beam 4 feet above the water in October 1954. Drowned despite the short fall. Body recovered. Jack C. Baker and Robert Coppin fell from a temporary catwalk near the top of the North Tower on June 6, 1956, 550 feet. Baker's body was recovered immediately. Coppin's body was never found after a 3-day search. It was both men's first day on the job. The deaths were noted. Families were compensated according to available formulas. Construction continued. Contrary to popular belief, none of them are entombed in the bridge. The concrete had already set. The bodies fell into water, not into piers. But the story persists. The idea that men are buried in the structure, that the bridge literally consumed them. The story is more accurate metaphorically than factually. By the time the foundations were complete, over 3,000 workers had labored on site, with another 7,000 working at other locations fabricating steel, spinning cable. The bridge was not being built by Michigan, it was being assembled by an industrial supply chain that stretched across the country, employing tens of thousands. And it was being financed by money that didn't exist yet, by tolls that couldn't be collected until the bridge opened, by revenue bonds that bet on future traffic, by a state that contributed operating funds only because the alternative was losing even more money on ferries. The foundations held. That was something. The cables went up in 1956, and watching them rise was like watching mathematics become visible. Each main cable would measure 24.25 inches in diameter when complete. Each would consist of 37 strands. Each strand would contain 340 individual wires, each wire measuring 0.196 inches in diameter. The total, $40 per wire stretched between anchor blocks, over towers, suspending the roadway that would eventually carry traffic. The process began with the construction of catwalks, temporary walkways made of cyclone fence material that allowed workers to move between the towers high above the water. The catwalks swayed in wind. They offered no protection from weather. Workers navigated them daily, carrying tools, positioning equipment, preparing for the cable spinning operation that would define the bridge's structural character. Cable spinning required precision. Each wire had to be positioned exactly, tensioned correctly, inspected continuously. The work proceeded strand by strand, wire by wire, day by day. Iron workers from Local 8, Local 25, and Local 340 performed the majority of the work. They were joined by workers from the American Bridge Division of U.S. Steel, the company responsible for fabricating and erecting the superstructure. The spinning operation moved slowly by necessity. Rush the work and the cables might not align properly. Misalign the cables and the entire load distribution of the bridge changes. Change the load distribution and the calculations that justified the design become meaningless. Speed was the enemy. Accuracy was survival. When the cables were complete, each was wrapped in a protective covering spun around the finished product. Then came the vertical suspender cables that would connect the main cables to the deck. These had to be positioned with equal precision, their lengths calibrated to account for the curve of the main cable and the level of the roadway. The deck itself presented its own challenges. Steinman's design called for an open-grid riding surface in the center span, a roadway made of steel grating rather than solid pavement. This feature allowed wind to pass through the bridge rather than pressing against it, reducing the aerodynamic forces that had destroyed the Tacoma Narrows Bridge. Drivers would feel the difference. The open grid created a distinct sound and sensation under tires. Some people found it unsettling. By summer 1957, the bridge approached completion. The towers stood. The cables stretched between them. The deck sections were being positioned and connected. Painting crews worked on sections that were finished while construction crews worked on sections not yet complete. The entire operation required coordination between dozens of contractors, hundreds of workers, and a timeline that could not extend past the bond's repayment schedule. Governor G. Menon Williams visited the site regularly. He had been governor during the entire construction period, a rare continuity in an era when political careers often ended abruptly. Williams understood that the bridge represented more than infrastructure. It represented the state's bet on its own future, a tangible expression of the idea that Michigan's two peninsulas belonged together, not just legally but physically. The bridge was scheduled to open November 1, 1950. Missing that deadline would mean additional financing costs, extended contractor obligations, continued ferry operations, and the political embarrassment of a project that promised punctuality and failed to deliver. On October 31, 1957, workers made final adjustments. Paint was still wet in places. Some finishing work remained incomplete, but the bridge was structurally sound, inspected, and approved for traffic. At midnight, the ferry service that had operated since 1923 stopped running. The boats that had carried 12 million vehicles and 30 million passengers over 34 years were decommissioned. 400 ferry workers lost their jobs. Some found work with the bridge. Most did not. The bridge opened on schedule. The calculations had been correct. The structure held. Whether it was worth building remained an open question that tolls would have to answer. The first toll was $3.25, and Governor Williams paid it himself on November 1, 1957. He drove across the bridge in the morning, then rode the final ferry crossing from St. Ignace to Mackinac City about an hour later, a ceremonial acknowledgment that one era had ended and another begun. The symbolism was deliberate. The economics were uncertain. The bridge had cost $100 million to build. It was financed entirely through revenue bonds, money borrowed against future toll collections. The Mackinac Bridge Authority existed as a legal entity with one purpose: collect enough money to pay back the bonds, maintain the structure, and operate the crossing. If toll revenue proved insufficient, the bonds would default. If the bonds defaulted, the lenders would have a claim on a bridge in the middle of nowhere connecting two sparsely populated regions. The tolls were not optional. The bridge sat on I-75, the only direct route between Michigan's peninsulas. Drivers could avoid it by traveling through Wisconsin, adding hundreds of miles to their journey. For practical purposes, the toll was mandatory for anyone who needed to cross. This created an unusual situation. A private sector financing model applied to public infrastructure, with captive customers and no competitive alternative. The ferry service had been subsidized because it lost money. The bridge would be self-sustaining because it had no choice. In its first year, the bridge carried approximately 3 million vehicles. Toll revenue exceeded operating costs, but barely. The debt service on $99 in bonds consumed most of the income. Maintenance costs were lower initially because the bridge was new, but everyone understood that a structure exposed to Great Lakes weather would require constant attention. Paint would deteriorate, steel would corrode, ice would damage piers. The open grid roadway would need replacement eventually. The authority hired a permanent staff: toll collectors, maintenance workers, engineers, administrators. These were year-round positions, unlike the seasonal ferry employment. The bridge didn't stop operating in winter. It couldn't. The toll revenue required continuous traffic. By the early 1960s, traffic volumes had increased. The bridge was handling over 3 million vehicles annually, generating revenue sufficient to cover operations and make scheduled bond payments. The math worked, which validated the financing structure, but also locked the bridge into a specific operational model: maintain traffic, collect tolls, service debt, repeat. The state's contribution of $417,000 annually for operations and maintenance helped during lean years, but it was exactly the amount the ferry service had been losing anyway. The legislature had not increased its financial commitment. It had merely redirected existing losses toward a different structure. Toll rates remained stable for years. $3.25 per passenger car became the baseline. Commercial vehicles paid per axle. The pricing model was simple. Heavier vehicles caused more wear, so they paid more. The authority reserved the right to adjust rates based on vehicle type, but the fundamental principle remained constant. Every crossing generated revenue, and all revenue supported the bridge. This created an incentive structure where traffic volume mattered more than anything else. More crossings meant more money. More money meant more capacity to maintain the structure and retire debt. The bridge's financial health depended on people continuing to need what it provided. In 1969, the tolls increased for the first time. The adjustment was modest but necessary. Maintenance costs had risen. Inflation had eroded the purchasing power of the original toll. The bonds still required servicing. The authority had no other revenue source. Drivers complained, as drivers always complain about tolls, but they paid. They had no alternative. The bridge was not a monument. It was a business. The business model was simple: charge for access, maintain the asset, pay the debt. As long as people kept crossing, the system worked. The question nobody asked publicly was what would happen if they stopped. By the 1970s, the bridge had developed its first operational rhythm: paint, inspect, repair, repeat. Painting the Mackinac Bridge takes 7 years. When the crew finishes, they start again. This is not metaphorical. This is the actual maintenance schedule, documented in budget reports and work orders filed annually with the Mackinac Bridge Authority. The bridge contains approximately 1 million square feet of surface area requiring coating. The Great Lakes climate, freeze-thaw cycles, salt spray, humidity fluctuations, UV exposure degrades protective coatings faster than in more temperate regions. For the first 30 years after opening, crews used lead-based paint. It adhered well. It lasted longer than alternatives. It also flaked off into the straits below, depositing heavy metals into water that connected 2 of the 5 Great Lakes. Nobody measured the environmental impact systematically. The paint worked, so they used it. Then the Environmental Protection Agency issued new guidelines in the 1980s requiring lead-based paint removal to be conducted within enclosures, tent-like structures that prevented paint chips from falling into the water or blowing onto populated areas. The cost of compliance was staggering. nearly $50 million over 21 years, requiring the authority to budget $2.2 million annually just for paint removal and reapplication. The enclosure method was also dangerous. Workers would sandblast old paint within sealed tents suspended 500 feet above the straits, in wind conditions that regularly exceeded 30 miles per hour. Senator Walter North, former chief executive of the Mackinac Bridge Authority, stated publicly that the process was flirting with death, that Michigan winds could hit the enclosure tents, break them apart, and kill someone in a passing car. The authority had no choice. Federal regulations mandated compliance. Non-compliance would trigger penalties and potentially jeopardize the bridge's operational permits. So they budgeted for enclosure work, knowing it would require toll increases to fund. In May 2003, for the first time in 34 years, the Mackinac Bridge Authority raised tolls significantly. Passenger cars increased from $1.50 to $2.50. Commercial vehicles jumped from $2 per axle to $3 per axle. The stated justification included $273 million in anticipated repairs and repainting over the next 15 years. The toll increase sparked immediate criticism. Emergency service providers who transported patients across the bridge multiple times daily saw their costs multiply. Small businesses in the Upper Peninsula that relied on frequent crossings to transport goods faced new operational expenses. Tourism operators worried that higher tolls would discourage visitors. The bridge was the only crossing point on Interstate 75 between Sault Ste. Marie and the Florida Keys. Drivers could complain, but they couldn't avoid paying. Maintenance costs continued rising. The original steel components, now decades old, required more frequent inspection. The open-grid roadway, Steinman's aerodynamic innovation, deteriorated faster than solid pavement would have. Individual grid sections had to be removed, inspected, repaired, or replaced, then reinstalled. Each operation required lane closures, traffic control, and worker safety measures on a bridge where wind gusts could reach 50 miles per hour on ordinary days. The cables required constant monitoring. 42,000 miles of wire under continuous tension, exposed to weather, supporting the entire deck load. Engineers inspected them regularly for corrosion, broken wires, and stress fractures. Finding problems was expensive. Fixing them was more expensive. Ignoring them was not an option. The towers needed attention too. Ice pressure in winter could damage the concrete piers despite Steinman's 20-to-1 safety factor. The armor plating protected the most vulnerable sections, but ice is patient. It pushes, retreats, pushes again. Over decades, even reinforced concrete develops weaknesses. By 2007, the authority raised tolls again. Passenger vehicles went to $4. Commercial vehicles to $5 per axle. The stated purpose: fund a $300 million renovation program that would include completely replacing the bridge deck. The 50-year-old structure was showing its age in ways that could no longer be deferred. The bridge collected approximately $15 million annually in toll revenue by the 2000s. Operating costs, maintenance expenses, and capital improvement projects consumed nearly all of it. The original bonds had been paid off, but new bonds were issued for major renovation work. The bridge was never debt-free for long. Paint, inspect, repair, repeat. The cycle never ended because the bridge never stopped being exposed to the conditions that required the cycle. And the money to fund the cycle could only come from one source: the cars that kept crossing. 4 million vehicles per year by 2019. Each one paying the toll. Each one contributing to the revenue stream that kept the structure standing. The paint that never stopped peeling required the tolls. That never stopped rising required the traffic that never stopped coming. Nobody asked what would happen if any part of that equation changed. September 22, 1982 was a Friday evening, and Leslie Ann Pluhar was driving north to visit her boyfriend in the Upper Peninsula. She was 31 years old. She worked as a waitress in Royal Oak, a suburb of Detroit nearly 300 miles south of the bridge. The drive would take her through the evening, across farmland and forest, past small towns that emptied out after dark until she reached the straits where the bridge waited. The weather was poor. Rain. Wind gusts measured at the bridge approached 48 miles per hour. Not unusual for the straits, but enough to make the crossing uncomfortable. The Mackinac Bridge Authority had not closed the bridge, Winds needed to exceed 65 miles per hour before officials stopped traffic entirely. 48 was manageable. Thousands of vehicles crossed in worse conditions. Plahar drove a 1987 Yugo, a subcompact car that weighed 1,832 pounds, light even by the standards of small cars. The Yugo had a reputation for being inexpensive and poorly built, though Plahar's specific vehicle had no documented mechanical problems prior to that evening. Witnesses later told investigators that they saw a small blue car swerve into oncoming traffic near the center of the span, then swerve back into the northbound lanes. The car hit the raised center grate, a 4-inch high median separating opposing traffic lanes, then veered toward the outer edge of the bridge. It struck the curb head-on at approximately 55 to 63 miles per hour, jumped a lower pipe railing, and flipped over a 3-foot-tall steel rail designed to contain vehicles traveling at reasonable speeds. The car fell 170 feet to the water, then it sank another 100 feet to the lake bottom. Nobody could immediately confirm who was in the vehicle or even how many people it contained. The fall happened too quickly. Traffic kept moving. Some drivers stopped, but most continued across the bridge, unaware that anything had occurred until they heard about it later on the news. The Michigan State Police began an investigation immediately. Divers were dispatched, but the weather that had contributed to the accident now prevented recovery efforts. Wind and waves made underwater work too dangerous. The search was aborted. Then attempted again, aborted again. Days passed. Michigan woke up on Saturday, September 23rd, to headlines that a car had plunged off the Mackinac Bridge. The story dominated front pages across the state. The Detroit Free Press and Detroit News ran multiple articles. Speculation began immediately. Was it the wind? Was the bridge unsafe? Could this happen again? The Mackinac Bridge Authority issued statements emphasizing that the bridge was structurally sound, that no damage had occurred to the railings or roadway, that the incident appeared to be an isolated accident. Officials noted that in 64 million crossings over 32 years, no vehicle had ever gone off the bridge. The statistics were accurate. They were also about to be revised. Donald Classen, a truck driver from Manitoba who witnessed the accident, told investigators the wind was so strong it was difficult to stand up when he got out of his vehicle. John Dunn of Saltstein. Mary said the car appeared to be lifted by the wind over the edge. These witness statements shaped the public narrative. The wind blew a small car off the bridge. The narrative was emotionally satisfying. It absolved the driver of responsibility while confirming widespread anxieties about the bridge's safety during high winds. It gave people a simple explanation for an event that defied their sense of how solid structures should behave. Bridges are not supposed to lose cars. If a car went over the edge, something extraordinary must have caused it. 8 days after the accident, on September 30th, a salvage crew finally recovered the Yugo and Plahar's body from the lake bottom. The vehicle was crushed almost beyond recognition, sustaining what investigators described as intense accordion damage from hitting a steel beam on the bridge before going over the side. The wreckage was so compressed that police had difficulty removing Plahar's body. Autopsy results provided uncomfortable details. Plahar had survived the fall. She suffered severe head and chest injuries but was alive when the car hit the water. She drowned. Her blood alcohol level was 0.01, well below any intoxication threshold. Toxicology found traces of caffeine and nicotine, a cup of coffee, and a cigarette the day she died. Nothing that would impair driving. The investigation produced a case file 11.5 feet thick and more than 6,000 pages long. Michigan State Police analyzed the accident scene, interviewed witnesses, examined the wreckage, consulted engineers, and reviewed bridge maintenance records. Their conclusion: Plahar was driving approximately 60 miles per hour, well above the posted 45-mile-per-hour limit, when she hit the median, lost control, and struck the curb at an angle and speed that launched the lightweight vehicle over the guardrail. The wind was a factor. The car's light weight was a factor. But the primary cause was speed. The Mackinac Bridge Authority maintained this position consistently. No design flaw, no structural failure. An accident caused by excessive speed and adverse conditions. The investigation supported this conclusion. The engineering analysis supported it. The physical evidence supported it. The public largely rejected it. The story that the wind blew Leslie Pluhar off the bridge persisted for decades. It circulated in local news coverage, in conversations among Michigan residents, in warnings parents gave their children about driving across the straits. The narrative was too compelling to abandon. A woman in a small car, a windy night, a tragic fall. The story explained itself without requiring anyone to imagine how terror and misjudgment might combine in the final seconds before impact. The Mackinac Bridge Authority made operational changes. They established protocols for high-wind events, issuing warnings and sometimes closing the bridge to high-profile vehicles during severe weather. They maintained a driver's assistance program for people with gephyrophobia, fear of bridges, allowing authority employees to drive their vehicles across the span. Approximately 400 people used this service in the year before Pluhar's death. Many more used it afterward. But the bridge never closed for ordinary cars in ordinary high winds. Traffic continued, tolls were collected. Revenue flowed to the authority, which allocated funds for maintenance, operations, and the endless cycle of inspection and repair. On March 2, 1997, another vehicle went off the bridge. Richard Allen Darabont drove his 1996 Ford Bronco over the edge. Investigators concluded it was intentional, suicide, not accident. The second death did not generate the same media coverage as the first. Suicide was a different category of tragedy, one that implicated the person rather than the structure. The bridge continued standing. People continued crossing. Some drove faster than they should. Some drove more carefully than necessary. The mathematics of structural engineering do not account for human psychology, but the bridge accommodates both the reckless and the terrified with equal indifference. Leslie Pluhar's death proved that the guardrails could be breached under specific conditions. It did not prove the bridge was unsafe. It proved that structures built for aggregate behavior, millions of crossings, statistical averages, acceptable risk thresholds, sometimes fail individual humans in ways that design parameters never anticipated. The wind did not blow her off the bridge. But the wind made a better story than speed and panic, and the moment when a small correction became an overcorrection became a point of no return. Stories simplify. Structures complicate. The bridge holds both. The bridge employs approximately 100 people year-round, and most of them are invisible to the 4 million vehicles that cross annually. Toll collectors are the exception. They sit in booths at the southern approach, collecting $4 per passenger vehicle, $5 per axle for commercial trucks, processing credit cards that now incur a 2.3% convenience fee as of January 1, 2025. The fee offsets processing costs of approximately $341,000 that the Mackinac Bridge Authority incurred in 2024. Every transaction cost is accounted for because the bridge has no revenue source except the tolls it collects and the modest state contribution that has remained essentially unchanged since the 1950s. Behind the toll booths exists an operational structure that most drivers never consider. Bridge painters work year-round on scaffolding, suspended hundreds of feet above the water. The painting never stops because the deterioration never stops. Inspectors walk the catwalks and access tunnels inside the towers, examining cable connections, checking for corrosion, documenting stress fractures that might indicate larger structural problems developing. Maintenance crews repair the open grid roadway, replace damaged sections, clear debris that accumulates in the grading. Engineers monitor traffic loads, wind speeds, ice pressure, and temperature fluctuations that cause the bridge to expand and contract by as much as 35 feet at the center span. The bridge moves. This is not a defect. This is intentional design. 31 expansion joints allow different segments to shift with temperature changes. The deck can move left or right up to 35 feet at the center, though normal movement is much less and not noticeable to drivers. The flexibility prevents catastrophic failure, but it also creates maintenance requirements. Moving parts wear out, joints need inspection. Flexibility requires constant attention. In August 1997, a bridge painter named Daniel Doyle fell from his painting platform and drowned in the Straits of Mackinac. He was the 6th person to die in connection with the bridge, 5 during construction, 1 during maintenance. His death shocked the authority and the community. The bridge was supposed to be safer after construction ended. Painters were supposed to use proper safety equipment. Accidents were not supposed to happen, but they did. Because the work required human beings to dangle from platforms in high winds, handling equipment, moving scaffolding, performing tasks that could not be fully automated, someone had to scrape old paint, someone had to apply new coatings, someone had to inspect the work afterward. The bridge could not maintain itself. The Michigan Department of Transportation honored Doyle and other highway workers who died on the job at the Clare Welcome Center, where a permanent memorial acknowledges the human cost of building and maintaining the state's transportation system. The memorial provides what officials called an opportunity to educate the public about the human cost of infrastructure. Most of the public drives past without stopping. Automation has reduced some labor requirements. Toll collection increasingly relies on MacPass, a prepaid account system that allows frequent crossers to avoid stopping at toll booths. The system processes transactions electronically, reducing the need for toll collectors during off-peak hours. But the bridge still requires human judgment at critical points. High winds necessitate decisions about whether to close lanes or restrict certain vehicle types. Ice conditions demand assessments about pier safety and structural integrity. Accidents require immediate response from personnel who understand the bridge's unique characteristics. The maintenance budget in a typical year runs approximately $16 million. This does not include major capital improvements, which require separate funding through bond issues or accumulated reserves. $16 million buys routine painting, regular inspections, minor repairs, staff salaries, insurance, utilities, and the administrative overhead of operating a bridge authority. The money comes from tolls. If toll revenue declines, maintenance budgets decline. If maintenance budgets decline, deferred work accumulates. If deferred work accumulates, small problems become large problems. This creates tension between the bridge's role as public infrastructure and its operation as a self-funding enterprise. Public infrastructure should be maintained regardless of revenue fluctuations. Self-funding enterprises cut costs when income drops. The Mackinac Bridge Authority exists in both categories simultaneously, subject to public expectations about safety and accessibility, while also constrained by the financial reality that it cannot spend money it does not collect. The workers understand this tension intimately. They see the budget reports. They know when toll revenue underperforms projections. They understand that their jobs depend on maintaining traffic volumes that justify their salaries. This does not make them indifferent to safety. Quite the opposite. A bridge that fails loses all traffic permanently. A bridge that requires closure for emergency repairs loses revenue during the closure and possibly afterward if drivers lose confidence. The incentive structure aligns maintenance with revenue generation, but only imperfectly. Short-term budget pressures might encourage deferring expensive repairs. Long-term structural integrity requires addressing problems before they become critical. The authority must balance these competing demands constantly, making decisions about which repairs to prioritize, which inspections to conduct more frequently, which components can wait another year. The workers who paint the bridge do not make these decisions. Neither do the toll collectors or the maintenance crews. They execute the maintenance plan developed by engineers and approved by the authority's board. But they live with the consequences of those decisions more directly than the drivers who cross once or twice per year. When the wind exceeds 50 miles per hour, the bridge restricts high-profile vehicles, trucks, campers, vehicles towing trailers. When it exceeds 65 miles per hour, the bridge closes entirely. These closures are rare but not unprecedented. Each closure costs the authority revenue from uncollected tolls. Each closure also prevents potential accidents that would cost far more in liability, emergency response, and reputational damage. The calculation is never purely financial, but it is never purely safety-focused either. The bridge must remain open to justify its existence. It must remain safe to remain open. The workers maintain the balance between these requirements every day, often in conditions that make the work dangerous even when properly executed. They are not heroes. They are employees doing jobs that happen to involve significant physical risk and unusual operational constraints. Some of them take pride in maintaining a landmark structure. Some of them view it as employment that pays better than available alternatives. Most of them probably hold both perspectives simultaneously because work is rarely just one thing. The bridge could not exist without them. But they could not exist without the bridge either. The structure and the labor sustain each other in a relationship that neither party controls individually. When Daniel Doyle fell in 1997, the painting work paused briefly, then resumed. The bridge required painting regardless of who had died painting it. Someone else took his place on the scaffolding. The work continued, because the work always continues. The memorial at the Clare Welcome Center lists his name alongside the construction workers who died in the 1950s. The list will grow. Infrastructure maintenance is not safe work. Pretending otherwise dishonors the people who do it and the families who lose them when the work goes wrong. The bridge stands because people keep it standing. This is literal, not metaphorical. The bridge connects two places that do not generate enough economic activity to justify its construction costs, and everyone involved understood this from the beginning. Mackinac City, at the southern end, had a population of approximately 875 people when the bridge opened in 1957. St. Ignace, at the northern end, had roughly 2,700. Combined, fewer than 4,000 residents lived in the communities the bridge directly connected. The Upper Peninsula as a whole contained approximately 300,000 people spread across 16,000 square miles, a population density lower than many rural counties in the Lower Peninsula. The economic justification for the bridge rested on three premises. Tourism would increase, commerce would flow more efficiently between peninsulas, and the intangible benefits of state unity would outweigh the measurable costs. Tourism did increase. Mackinac Island, accessible by ferry from either Mackinac City or St. Ignace, had been attracting visitors since the late 1800s. The Grand Hotel, built in 1887, catered to wealthy vacationers who could afford the journey north. But tourism remained limited by the ferry bottleneck. Long wait times discouraged casual visitors. The seasonal nature of ferry operations meant that autumn and winter tourism barely existed. The bridge changed this. Suddenly, reaching the Straits took the same time as driving to any other location along Interstate 75. The 280-mile trip from Detroit to Mackinac City was no longer followed by an hour-long ferry wait and crossing. Tourists could plan itineraries without accounting for ferry schedules. Weekend trips became feasible. The Upper Peninsula opened to travelers who would not have attempted the journey otherwise. Mackinac City transformed itself into a tourist destination rather than just a ferry terminal. Motels appeared. Restaurants expanded. Gift shops proliferated. The town marketed itself as the gateway to the north, selling not just lodging and food, but the experience of crossing the bridge itself. Fort Michilimackinac, a reconstruction of an 18th-century wooden stockade, became an attraction. The bridge became an attraction. Everything became an attraction because tourism was the only industry that made economic sense in a town of fewer than 1,000 permanent residents. St. Ignace followed a similar pattern, though with less intensity. The town remained smaller, quieter, more oriented toward serving local needs than capturing tourist dollars. But it benefited from increased traffic nonetheless. Gas stations stayed open year-round. Motels operated beyond the traditional summer season. The economic activity was modest but measurable. The Upper Peninsula's economy remained largely unchanged. Logging, mining, and manufacturing continued as they had before the bridge. The structure did not create new industries or fundamentally alter economic relationships. It made existing activities slightly more convenient and slightly less expensive by reducing transportation time and eliminating ferry costs. These incremental benefits accumulated over decades but never produced the economic transformation some advocates had predicted. Commerce between peninsulas increased, but not dramatically. The Upper Peninsula exported timber, minerals, and manufactured goods to the Lower Peninsula. The Lower Peninsula exported consumer goods, professional services, and capital investment to the Upper Peninsula. The bridge made these exchanges more efficient, but efficiency gains are difficult to quantify. Did businesses expand because of the bridge, or would they have expanded anyway? Did consumers purchase more goods because transportation costs decreased, or did they simply purchase the same goods more conveniently? The intangible benefits, state unity, psychological connection, symbolic importance, cannot be measured in revenue or GDP. Governor Williams understood this when he paid the first toll and rode the last ferry. The bridge represented an idea. that Michigan was one state, not two regions separated by an accident of geography. Whether the idea justified $100 million in construction costs and ongoing maintenance expenses depends on how much value one assigns to symbolic unity. The bridge's financial model did not require economic transformation to succeed, it required traffic. As long as people kept crossing, toll revenue would cover operations and debt service. The bridge did not need to create prosperity. It needed to remain necessary. And it did remain necessary, but for reasons more complex than the original economic projections suggested. The bridge became necessary because it existed. Before its construction, people adapted to the ferry system's limitations. They planned trips differently, timed crossings to avoid congestion, accepted delays as part of traveling between peninsulas. After construction, these adaptations disappeared. The bridge established new expectations about travel time and accessibility. These expectations created dependency. Closing the bridge, even temporarily, now causes disruptions that would have been impossible before 1957 because the alternative infrastructure no longer exists. The ferries are gone. The workers who operated them have retired or moved to other jobs. The institutional knowledge of running a cross-straits ferry service has dissipated. Returning to the old system is not an option. The bridge must remain open because there is no fallback. This dependency extends beyond transportation. The Upper Peninsula's economy, modest as it is, now assumes bridge access. Businesses make location decisions based on the ability to reach Lower Peninsula markets within predictable time frames. Residents accept employment in one peninsula while living in the other because the commute is feasible. Emergency medical services transport patients across the bridge to hospitals with specialized capabilities. These arrangements would be difficult or impossible without the bridge. The structure has created its own necessity by eliminating alternatives and embedding itself into systems that depend on its continuous operation. This is not unusual. Infrastructure generally works this way, but it makes questions about the bridge's original justification somewhat irrelevant. Whether the bridge should have been built matters less than the fact that it was built and cannot now be unbuilt without severe consequences. The economic case for the bridge was always weak if evaluated purely on direct financial returns. The $100 million construction cost would take decades to recover through toll revenue, even without accounting for maintenance expenses. The state's annual contribution of $417,000 represented a subsidy that continues in adjusted form today. The bond financing structure shifted costs to future users but did not eliminate them. Yet the bridge stands and traffic increases annually. In 2022, the 200th millionth vehicle crossed. The milestone was celebrated with ceremony and gifts for the family whose car happened to be the one that triggered the counter. They received a framed print of the bridge and a basket of local products, tourism commodities enabled by the structure they were crossing. The bridge did not make Mackinac City or St. Ignace into economic powerhouses. It made them into tourism stops, service economies built around providing amenities to people traveling through rather than destinations in themselves. The Upper Peninsula did not transform into an industrial center. It remained what it had always been, a resource extraction region with beautiful scenery and low population density. The bridge's economic legacy is not prosperity, but persistence. It created conditions for modest growth in specific sectors while facilitating continuation of existing patterns. It did not revolutionize the regional economy. It maintained it, which may have been the more realistic goal all along. The workers who built it died for a structure that would not make the regions it connected wealthy. The drivers who use it pay tolls that fund maintenance for infrastructure that serves them individually but does not transform their communities collectively. The bridge succeeds by remaining necessary without becoming transformative. This is perhaps the most honest assessment. The bridge works because it has made itself irreplaceable, not because it fulfilled the economic promises used to justify its construction. The promises were aspirational. The necessity is operational. The math works because the cars keep coming, and the cars keep coming because the bridge is there, and the bridge stays there because the math works. The circularity is the entire system. The most persistent myth about the Mackinac Bridge is that workers are entombed in the concrete piers, their bodies sealed forever beneath the water. This is false. The Mackinac Bridge Authority has addressed the claim repeatedly on their website, in press releases, in response to questions from journalists and curious citizens. The facts are documented. 5 men died during construction. Frank Pepper died in a diving accident. James Lesarge fell into a caisson while welding. Albert Abbott fell a few feet into the water and drowned. Jack Baker and Robert Coppin fell from a catwalk near the top of the North Tower. 4 bodies were recovered. Coppin's body was never found, but he fell into open water 550 feet below, not into wet concrete. None of them are in the bridge. The concrete had set before the deaths occurred, or the deaths occurred in locations where no concrete was being poured. The myth contradicts the timeline, the construction sequence, and the physical evidence. It is demonstrably untrue. It is also impossible to kill. The story circulates through Michigan like folklore, passed from person to person, region to region, generation to generation. Parents tell it to children as a cautionary tale about industrial work. Teachers mention it in classrooms when discussing local history. Tourists repeat it to each other while crossing the bridge, glancing down at the water, imagining bodies sealed in the towers beneath them. The story persists because it feels true in a way that facts cannot address. What does it mean that people prefer the false version? The myth simplifies the deaths into a single image, bodies consumed by the structure they were building, literally incorporated into the bridge, their sacrifice made permanent through physical entombment. This is emotionally coherent. It gives the deaths meaning. The workers didn't just fall, they became part of something larger. Their bodies merged with the monument they created. The reality is messier. Frank Pepper died from decompression sickness, a failure of physiology and safety protocols. James Lesarge fell 40 feet and suffered fatal head injuries, a failure of fall protection. Albert Abbott drowned in shallow water, a failure of rescue response. Jack Baker and Robert Coppin fell on their first day of work because a temporary catwalk failed, a failure of construction oversight and worker training. These deaths were preventable. They resulted from decisions about acceptable risk, cost-benefit calculations that prioritize schedule and budget over comprehensive safety measures. Workers in the 1950s had access to safety harnesses, but the bridge was built without requiring them. Nets could have been strung beneath work areas, but they weren't. The deaths were not inevitable tragedies. They were systemic failures disguised as individual misfortunes. The myth of entombment erases this. It transforms preventable deaths into noble sacrifice, as if the bridge required human offerings to stand. This is comforting in a perverse way. It suggests the deaths had purpose, that the workers' bodies literally support the structure, that their sacrifice was necessary rather than wasteful. But they are not in the bridge. They did not become part of it. Their deaths accomplished nothing except demonstrating that the contractors valued speed over safety and that workers in the 1950s had limited power to demand better conditions. The families were compensated according to formulas available at the time. These formulas calculated the economic value of a worker's future earnings and provided a percentage to survivors. The amounts were modest. They reflected the legal standards of the era, which treated workplace deaths as unfortunate but expected costs of industrial development. No one went to prison. No contractor lost their license. Construction continued. The monument, erected in 2004 at Bridgeview Park in St. Ignace, lists the 5 names and acknowledges the labor unions that built the bridge: Iron Workers Local 8, Local 25, Local 340, and the American Bridge Company. The monument is small, easily overlooked, located in a park that most tourists drive past without stopping. It provides the correct information about the deaths. It does not generate the same cultural resonance as the myth. Why do myths persist when truth is readily available? Partly because myths serve psychological needs that facts cannot fulfill. The entombment story gives the bridge a haunted quality, a sense that something beyond engineering holds it together. This makes crossing it feel significant, even sacred. The bridge is not just infrastructure. It is a memorial to the workers who died building it, their presence literally supporting every crossing. Partly because myths travel better than complex truths. Workers are buried in the bridge is a single sentence, easily remembered, emotionally evocative. 5 workers died in separate incidents during construction due to inadequate safety measures, but none of them are physically present in the structure. requires more words, more precision, more willingness to engage with uncomfortable details about how industrial projects prioritize efficiency over human life. Partly because the myth shifts responsibility. If workers are entombed in the bridge, their deaths become part of the bridge's essential nature rather than failures that could have been prevented. The structure required sacrifice. This was the price of building something great. No one is to blame because everyone understands that great achievements demand great costs. This is, of course, nonsense. The bridge did not require those deaths. It required better safety protocols, more time for workers to train, willingness to spend money on protective equipment rather than maximizing profit margins. The deaths were not sacrifices. They were consequences of choices made by people who had the power to choose differently. Robert Coppen's body was never recovered. It remains somewhere in the Straits of Mackinac, on the lake bottom, not in the bridge, but near it. Divers searched for 3 days and found nothing. The search was called off. Construction resumed. Coppen disappeared into the water, and the water kept his body, and the bridge rose anyway. This is the actual story. It lacks the symbolic neatness of the myth. It does not provide closure or meaning. It simply is. A man fell, died, was never found, and the structure he was helping build was completed without him. The myth says he is in the bridge. The truth says he is nowhere anyone can find. The myth is more satisfying. The truth is more accurate. People choose the myth because truth offers nothing except the knowledge that preventable deaths were not prevented. The Mackinac Bridge stands on engineering principles, not on buried bodies. Steel, concrete, cable, and precise calculation hold it up. Human beings maintain it. Human beings cross it. Human beings died building it, but their deaths contributed nothing structural to the bridge. They were waste, not sacrifice. The myth suggests otherwise because accepting waste requires confronting systems that treat human life as an operating expense, something to be managed and minimized but not eliminated when elimination would cost too much or delay a schedule. Myths are easier. Myths give meaning to loss. Myths suggest that the dead are still here, incorporated into the structure, still supporting us as we cross. But they are not here. They are dead. The bridge stands because of engineering, not because of ghosts. Believing otherwise is comforting. It is also a lie. The Mackinac Bridge Authority will likely continue correcting this myth for as long as people tell it, which means forever. Facts do not compete well against stories that people want to believe. The bridge will keep standing. The myth will keep circulating. The men who died will continue being remembered incorrectly because the false version gives their deaths a significance the true version cannot provide. This is not respect. But it is persistent. The bridge is now 67 years old, and it has never been debt-free. The original bonds were paid off decades ago, serviced by toll revenue collected over 40-plus years from millions of vehicles. But new bonds were issued for the deck replacement, for the paint and closure system, for foundation repairs, for cable inspections that revealed problems requiring immediate attention. The Mackinac Bridge Authority operates in a permanent state of managed debt, borrowing against future toll revenue to fund present maintenance needs. This is not unusual for infrastructure. Bridges, roads, water systems, they all require continuous investment that exceeds annual operating budgets. What makes the Mackinac Bridge different is its isolation, both geographic and financial. It cannot spread costs across a broader tax base. It cannot defer maintenance by shifting traffic to alternative routes. It stands alone, funding itself, maintaining itself, operating under constraints that would bankrupt a less trafficked structure. Traffic in 2024 exceeded 4.5 million vehicles. Toll revenue approached $20 million annually. Operating and maintenance costs consumed most of it. The surplus funded capital reserves for future projects that engineers know are coming. Eventually, the cables will need replacement. The towers will require reinforcement. These are not possibilities. They are certainties, scheduled decades in advance by the deterioration rates of steel and concrete exposed to Great Lakes weather. The bridge has become what it was always going to become, a structure that exists primarily to perpetuate its own existence. The tolls fund the maintenance that allows the bridge to remain open so that tolls can continue being collected. The circularity is complete. The bridge is no longer a means to an end, connection between peninsulas, economic development, state unity. It is an end in itself, an operational system that must continue operating because stopping is not an option. The communities it connects have changed, though not dramatically. Mackinac City remains a tourism economy, its population swelling in summer, contracting in winter, dependent on people who come to cross the bridge or visit Mackinac Island or experience the nostalgia of northern Michigan vacations. St. Ignace remains smaller, quieter, more focused on serving year-round residents than capturing tourist dollars. The Upper Peninsula's economy remains resource-based, timber, mining, tourism, supplemented by retirees seeking affordable housing and natural beauty. The bridge did not transform these places. It connected them, which is what it was designed to do. Whether connection alone justifies the cost depends on values that cannot be measured in revenue or GDP. Some things are worth building because they should exist, not because they generate profit. Other things are built because the political and financial conditions align in a moment that permits their construction, and whether they should exist becomes irrelevant once they do. The workers who maintain the bridge today inherit a structure built by workers who are mostly dead or retired. The institutional knowledge transfers imperfectly. Engineers study Steinman's original specifications and make educated guesses about his intentions when documentation is ambiguous. Painters learn techniques from older painters who learned from workers who might have trained under original crew members. The bridge persists through accumulated expertise, maintained by people who understand it intimately without necessarily understanding why certain choices were made 70 years ago. Governor Williams began the tradition of leading the annual Labor Day Bridge Walk in 1958. Governors have continued the tradition through administration changes, political shifts, economic crises, and periods when state government could barely function. The walk attracts 50,000 to 80,000 people annually, most of them walking the 5 miles from St. Ignace to Mackinac City on a bridge that is otherwise closed to pedestrians. The walk serves multiple purposes. It is a celebration, a tourist attraction, a political photo opportunity, and a reminder that the bridge belongs to the public, even though it operates as a self-funding authority. For a few hours each year, people can experience the bridge as pedestrians rather than drivers, feeling the movement of the deck beneath their feet, seeing the towers up close, understanding the scale in ways that driving 60 miles per hour through the center span does not permit. The tradition also reinforces mythology. Participants often mention the workers who died during construction, sometimes repeating the entombment myth, sometimes acknowledging the truth but assigning it symbolic weight it may not deserve. The dead become symbols regardless of accuracy. They represent sacrifice, danger, the price of progress, the human cost of infrastructure, whatever meaning individual walkers need them to represent. The bridge does not care. It stands because engineering principles keep it standing. It moves because temperature changes require movement. It requires maintenance because exposure to weather degrades all materials eventually. It collects tolls because revenue funds operations. These are mechanical relationships, unaffected by how people interpret them. Leslie Pluhar has been dead for 35 years. Her death remains the most publicly discussed incident in the bridge's history, more than the construction deaths, more than the maintenance worker who fell in 1997, more than the apparent suicide in 1997. Why her death resonates more than others is unclear. Possibly because it was unexpected. Drivers do not anticipate falling off bridges. Possibly because the initial explanation, wind, felt more dramatic than the actual cause. Possibly because she was a woman traveling alone, which invites narrative construction around vulnerability and tragedy. Or possibly because her death forced acknowledgement that the bridge, for all its engineering sophistication, cannot prevent every accident. It can be designed to withstand 642 mile-per-hour winds. It can be maintained to exacting standards. It can operate safety protocols and restrict traffic during severe weather. But it cannot prevent a driver from traveling too fast in poor conditions and losing control at exactly the wrong location. The bridge's safety record is excellent. 2 vehicles over the side in 67 years of operation out of more than 250 million crossings. Statistically insignificant, individually devastating. The future of the bridge is simultaneously certain and uncertain. It will continue operating as long as maintenance continues and traffic volumes justify the expense. It will require periodic renovations that will be funded through toll increases or bond issues or state contributions that may or may not materialize depending on political priorities. It will eventually need interventions so expensive that difficult questions will be asked about whether continued operation makes financial sense. But the bridge has made itself necessary. Closing it is not a realistic option. Replacing it is not financially feasible. Construction costs would exceed $1 billion at current prices, possibly much more. The bridge must continue because the alternative is unacceptable, which means the bridge will continue regardless of whether purely economic analysis supports that conclusion. This is the condition of infrastructure built in one era and maintained in another. The decision to build has already been made. The only remaining question is how much society is willing to pay to keep the structure functional. The Mackinac Bridge will be painted, inspected, repaired, repeated. The cables will be monitored. The deck will be maintained. The towers will be reinforced. The toll booths will collect revenue. The workers will do their jobs. The traffic will continue. The system will perpetuate itself because the system has been designed to perpetuate itself and because no one has proposed a viable alternative. David Steinman died in 1960, 3 years after the bridge opened. He did not live to see it become the longest suspension bridge in the Western Hemisphere by total suspended length, or to watch it handle decades of traffic without structural failure, or to know that his aerodynamic innovations would influence bridge design worldwide. He died knowing he had built something significant. Whether it was worth building, he could not have known. That question requires a longer timeline than any individual possesses. Prentice Brown died in 1973, having served as chairman of the Mackinac Bridge Authority until his death. He is buried in Lakeside Cemetery in St. Ignace, on the shores of the Straits he spent decades trying to bridge. The view from his grave includes the structure he fought to finance. Whether that proximity provides any satisfaction to the dead is unknowable. For the living, it serves as a reminder that infrastructure projects outlive their advocates, for better or worse. The 5 construction workers, Pepper, Lesarge, Abbott, Baker, Coppin, have their names on a monument that most people do not visit. Their families received compensation according to formulas that valued their future earnings at rates that seem insultingly low by contemporary standards. Their deaths were preventable, which makes them tragedies rather than sacrifices, but the distinction is rarely maintained. The bridge stands, traffic crosses, tolls are collected, maintenance continues. The math works because the cars keep coming, and the cars keep coming because the bridge is there, and the bridge stays there because the math works. Was it worth building? The bridge cannot answer. It can only stand and wait for traffic and deteriorate according to predictable timelines and require maintenance that must be funded somehow. The people who cross it daily do not ask the question. They pay the toll and drive forward, trusting that someone has done the calculations correctly, that the structure will hold, that the 42,000 miles of cable and the 552 feet of tower and the 8,614 feet of suspended steel will support them for another crossing. Most of the time it does. That is what infrastructure means. Reliable support that becomes invisible through repetition. The bridge is there, so people use it, so the bridge remains necessary, so it must be maintained, so tolls are collected, so the bridge remains there. The circle closes. The system sustains itself. The question of worth becomes irrelevant once the structure exists and dependency follows. The Mackinac Bridge is not heroic, it is persistent. That may be the more important quality.